The Philippine president outlines his plan for the future and wants the death penalty reintroduced for drug dealers. While many Filipinos support his policies, his critics demand his resignation. Has Rodrigo Duterte delivered on his promises? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. Rodrigo Duterte is a divisive president for many Filipinos. He's praised by his supporters for combating crime and corruption, but his opponents say the crackdown comes at a high price, with thousands killed in an internationally condemned campaign against illegal drugs. Duterte is promising more of the same. As he delivered his annual State of the Nation speech, he urged Congress to reinstate the death penalty for drugs offenders, and he defended his handling of territorial disputes with the Chinese in the South China Sea. As he spoke, Duterte's opponents burned an effigy of him outside Parliament and urged his resignation. Jamila Lindegan has more from Manila.
Right at the top of President Rodrigo Duterte's speech today was a reiteration that his bloody so-called war on drugs will continue till the end of his term. He also even appealed for Congress for the passage and the imposition of the death penalty for illegal drugs and plunder. Duterte also admits that his government remains corruption-driven and threatens to prosecute erring public officials, he says, to the hilt. There's really nothing different from the speech of Duterte today compared to his last few State of the Nation speeches, except today he started his speech over an hour later than scheduled. He arrived late in Congress today. But outside the halls of Congress, where tens of thousands of Filipinos have taken to the streets in protest, they suggested that instead of talking, President Rodrigo Duterte should listen instead. They say he has failed on almost every promise during his campaign. And the perceived capitulation to China, his basically acceptance that the government is not in control of what's happening in the South China Sea, is, they say, is perceived capitulation to a bigger power. They also say that the so-called bloody war on drugs, which has left, according to activists, more than 20,000 people dead, is proof, they say, that the president is unfit to govern and they want him to resign. Now, State of the Nation speeches of Philippine presidents are meant to highlight achievements made by the government over the past year. But protesters here tell us that this is nothing but a mere cover-up of grave human rights violations committed against the Filipino people over the past few years. This is Jamila Lindegan for Inside Story.
Now, here are some of the main issues that Duterte has vowed to resolve. The president ordered a crackdown on illegal drugs, such as crystal meth, 3 years ago. Since then, the government says police have killed around 6,000 dealers and users. Rights groups say the true total is 27,000. The UN has called for an international investigation. Duterte is the first Philippine president from Mindanao in the south, which has a large Muslim population. Despite a peace deal on Muslim autonomy, the island remains under martial law. Duterte sent troops to the city of Marawi 2 years ago to root out fighters linked to ISIL. And the Philippines and China have long disputed territory in the South China Sea. Opponents criticize Duterte for allowing Chinese trawlers to fish in Philippine waters. Well, let's bring in our panel now for today's Inside Story. In Manila, we have Richard Heydarian, who's a research fellow at the National Chengchi University and author of the book, The Rise of Duterte, a Populist Revolt. In Singapore, we have Ong-Webb, who's a research fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And also in Manila, Conde, who is the Philippines researcher at Human Rights Watch. Welcome to you all. Thank you very much for being on Inside Story. Let's start by looking at the big picture, Richard Heydarian. As Duterte said in his speech, his disapproval rating is only 3%. The majority of Filipinos are satisfied with him. How have things improved for Filipinos under Duterte's rule these past 3 years?
Well, definitely we can have a debate over the specifics of whether objectively has been successful in achieving his promises. But the fact of the matter is that as far as the perception of the majority of Filipinos is concerned, he's now the most popular Filipino president in history. And in the last midterm elections, the opposition was almost completely wiped off. And now he currently has supermajority in both houses of the Congress. So this is a very dominant, confident president. And we saw how he started this speech by essentially saying that there are very few who are opposing him. And there are people there in the House of Congress that you should not be among those few 3% people who are opposing me. Now, fact of the matter is that the president also has few years left in office. He's now in his legacy years, and by perhaps third quarter of 2021, he's going to be already a lame duck president as everyone focuses their attention to his successor. So he has very dominant on one hand. The perception of the people is that he's doing the right job, but at the same time, he doesn't have all the time in the world. He has to push for as much reform as he can. And his State of the Nation address, he was very clear. He admitted that when it comes to the war on drugs, when it comes to law and order, and more than anything, when it comes to corruption, there's a lot to be done. But his argument is that he is the ultimate solution. Even if he may have not yet solved those problems, people need someone like him, a decisive leader like him, in order to move forward. And the fact of the matter is that the economy is still doing well. He halved the inflation from 6.7% to 2.7% in less than a year. He pushed for the Bangsamoro law, which pushes Mindanao towards creating its own Muslim majority autonomous region. And as far as foreign relations is concerned, Philippine relations with most of the countries is going well, with perhaps
we'll
the
look at
exception of
those
China.
issues in more detail in just a few minutes, Richard. Let me ask Carlos Conde in Manila for his views. Did you hear anything new in this speech, Carlos? And what's your mark on President Duterte three years into his role?
Well, as most of these so-called State of the Nation addresses in the Philippines, a lot of them are aspirational. And so in that sense, I didn't hear anything new. I mean, about the only new thing that I heard today was when he claimed that the Marawi siege in Mindanao in 2017 was largely driven by illegal drugs, which was something that was quite different from the government version at that time, which is that it was an ISIL, precipitated event. But overall, the past 3 years, as far as we're concerned from the human rights community, has been catastrophic for human rights in the Philippines. And it is something that President Duterte, that will mark the legacy of President Duterte. Now, of course, we're not saying that all the past 3 years have been bad in terms of policy. There have been some what proponents would say as good indicators of good leadership in the past 3 years, and they hope that in the next 3 years that would continue to happen. But I think the dominant theme, the dominant issue that has marked the past 3 years, and I think will also mark the next 3 years, will be the catastrophic human rights violations in the Philippines related to the drug war.
Okay, Graham Ong-Webb in Singapore, your thoughts. It's true that there's been a lot of concern over human rights, the human rights situation in the Philippines. How has Rodrigo Duterte fared, in your opinion, in his on his most notable promises?
Well, I largely concur with the comments of my two compatriots on this panel. Perhaps what I could share is a regional perspective, since I sit in Singapore and not in the Philippines. But nevertheless, as a member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, I would say that this is really a very odd situation to be observing what's going on in the Philippines. Sort of the best of times and the worst of times. We're looking at a very dramatic political play in the Philippines, as mentioned by my two compatriots, highly divided nation, highly polarized, very strongman politics, in a true Trumpian style. But at the same time, I would say that the business community in the region is very happy with the economic performance of the country. This is the best of times for the Philippines economy. The peso is one of the top currency performers, rising at 3% this year. The basic stock index, bull run last week, 8,000 points at the key level. I mean, this is a disjunct between what's going on economically and in terms of politics. And I would say that many leaders in the region would like to have what President Duterte is having.
Right.
This consolidated power, which is, with the ability to behave almost with impunity at this point.
All right, let's now focus on some of the key issues of Duterte's presidency, and his signature issue, his campaign issue, of course, has been the war on drugs. As we mentioned, President Duterte has urged Congress to bring back the death penalty in the war on drugs. Let's take a listen.
The illegal drug problem persists corruption continues and emasculate the courage we need to sustain our moral recovery initiatives. I respectfully request Congress to reinstate the death penalty for heinous crimes related to drugs as well as plunder.
All right, Richard Heydarian in Manila. The president has pushed for the reinstatement of the death penalty since he was campaigning back in 2016. Do you think he'll succeed this time around?
Well, he has, at least on paper, a supermajority in both houses of the Congress. And if you look at the leadership of both the lower house, his former vice presidential mate, Speaker of the House, Cayetano, and also the Senate President Soto, both of them seem to embrace his kind of illiberal views about how the Philippines should move forward in dealing with law and order issues. Now, the problem, of course, is that the Philippines had death penalty in the past, and yet there's no evidence to suggest that death penalty in any ways made the situation of crime or drugs any better in the Philippines. And I think this is the problem with President Duterte. He's good in terms of impressing people with his decisive leadership, or at least projecting decisive leadership. But a lot of his claims are not really necessarily backed up by science and public policy that is empirically based.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that even in his war on drugs, we have a huge problem because until today, not many big fishes or major drug syndicate leaders have been caught, while at the same time, there are thousands of unexplained deaths, including 100 deaths of children.
Right. Carlos Conde, surprisingly, we didn't hear any reaction from the president during his speech today to the UN Human Rights Council resolution, which called for an international investigation into the unlawful killings linked to the war on drugs in the Philippines. Why do you think that is?
Actually, that was kind of, as you said, a surprise that he didn't even mention the UN Human Rights Council resolution. I mean, you can look at it any other way, but I think the government has been put on notice by the UN Human Rights Council, and that you can read it as he's afraid, or that he is very concerned about this action by the United Nations Human Rights Council. But also at the same time, I think this push for the death penalty will alienate President Duterte and his government further from Western democracies, particularly in Europe, who are very, very worried about the restoration of the death penalty. This is a very, very important issue to them, and I'm pretty sure they're looking at it very closely. And this will definitely work against him, particularly in the days ahead when the UN Human Rights Council or the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights looks into the human rights abuses in the Philippines.
Graham, Ong-Webb, your thoughts about this international investigation that's been requested by the UN Human Rights Council into the war on drugs in the Philippines. How damaging would it be for President Duterte?
Well, it remains to be seen how damaging it's going to be. I bear some skepticism because, zooming out at the regional level, I would add the comment that I think we're seeing an overall alienation of the region in terms of the dismal human rights track record we're seeing across Southeast Asia. So if the Burmese government is able to get away with accused human rights atrocities going on in the Rakhine State crisis, with the concerns we've seen over the current Thai administration over their human rights transgressions over the last few years, I think President Duterte will also likely get away with a fair bit. I think overall there's this regional cover going on where several Southeast Asian nations are simply looking the other way.
Right.
We have an ASEAN Human Rights Commission here sitting in this region, which is also looking the other way and not saying very much. So
do you think
I'm quite skeptical
these
that
countries can
Duterte
ever win?
Do
you think these countries can ever win the war on drugs, including the Philippines, if they keep treating it as a criminal problem?
Well, I don't think so, because the roots of the matter are not being taken to task, as our compatriots were just talking about earlier. We're yet to see the dismantlement of organized crime, the dismantlement of these criminal infrastructures. The very same problems we're seeing the way in which the Indonesian government has been trying to tackle, its war on drugs, or likewise in Malaysia. So I think what's been going on so far is highly ineffective.
All right, let's now take a look at the issue of security in the southern Philippines and the fight against armed groups there. President Rodrigo Duterte, in his speech, promised that peace will soon return to Muslim-majority areas in the southern Philippines. Take a listen.
It is my hope that the Bangsamoro transition will fast-track the establishment of regional government that will secure and comfortable life for Muslim brothers and sisters and all indigenous communities in the Bangsamoro regions.
Richard Heydarian, the city of Marawi was, of course, devastated in a siege with armed rebels 2 years ago. The attack prompted Duterte to declare martial law across the entire island of Mindanao. Has the security situation improved at all in the region and in the southern Philippines?
Well, actually, I was in Marawi earlier this month, and I got to visit the city and talk to community leaders and commanders on the ground. My sense is that in terms of security, the situation has improved dramatically. You don't have this kind of sense of a specter of ISIS takeover return anytime soon, although there are still remnants of the Maute group and the ISIS elements there. I think the security situation has improved, and you can see only a few checkpoints, security checkpoints across the city. And we did not demand a lot of security detail when we were traveling across Marawi and also in Butig, which is the Maute stronghold. But the problem, though, is twofold. One of the things I hear a lot from the local civil society organization leaders is that up until today, there has not been a proper investigation in order to understand how on earth did a bunch of ragtag ISIS-affiliated elements get to lay a 5-month-old siege on the entire city, which led to the complete destruction of Ground Zero, which is the heartland of Marawi City. How did it why did it take so long for the government? Why did the negotiations fail to end it early on? And the second one is this concern that when it comes to rehabilitation of Marawi, there's not much consultation with the groups on the ground, with grassroots groups. And the blueprint that has been provided is full of white elephants, but little consideration for internal displaced people. So there is more a long-term threat of return of radicalism as disgruntlement begins to seep in. Nonetheless, majority of people in Marawi keep on telling me, we still trust in President Duterte. He is one of us, and at least he pushed the Bangsamoro law, which could finally give us the kind of autonomy. So still, President Duterte has support in Marawi, despite everything on the ground.
Carlos, what do you think it will take for the Duterte administration to be successful in Marawi?
Well, the Duterte administration will have to work very, very closely with the local political leaders there, obviously. I mean, there are a lot of issues that are still unresolved in Marawi. I mean, as Mr. Heydarian pointed out, rehabilitation is one of them. The people there are not, have not been involved in the rehabilitation efforts there, and not much, the government has not much to show for in terms of that. So there's a lot of reaching out to the government that needs to do to the local leaders, and more especially to the affected ones, you know, the communities, the ordinary Muslims, the ordinary Moros who have been displaced by the war even to this day. So there are a lot of, keep in mind also that the whole of Mindanao, particularly in Marawi and in the Muslim areas, they are under martial law right now, and there have been sporadic reports of conflict every now and then. So much as we hope the situation there has stabilized, I don't think that's a completely accurate picture because of the things that we're hearing from the ground.
Graham, as Carlos pointed out earlier, interestingly, in his speech today, President Duterte tried to connect the problem of terrorism in the southern Philippines with the problem of drugs. Is that the case? Can you make that connection?
No, I can't make the connection either, and I agree with the analysis that's been given so far. Yeah, that there is simply no connection, and it's actually a surprise because that wasn't the narrative of the arguments made, in the aftermath or during the period of the siege. So I think clearly there's a political agenda in trying to bolster the cause in the war against drugs, and the measures in order to achieve success in that war. From President Duterte's point of view, there is clearly no basis for that statement.
Okay, now let's take a look at the issue of foreign policy. And Rodrigo Duterte has been criticized for failing to confront China and its activities in the disputed South China Sea. But the president, in his speech, defended his approach.
Rather than go there and have a confrontation, not necessarily the great ships, warships, but, a squabble there could lead to something else. So, we just became friends. And perhaps we can talk about this.
All right, Richard, Duterte has said he can't do anything about what is called China's bullying in the South China Sea, in the disputed areas, saying that if doing so could trigger an all-out war. Why the seemingly soft stance, you think, when it comes to the Philippines' territorial dispute with China?
Well, in fairness to President Duterte, I think in his State of the Nation address, he was much more calibrated in his language. For long, he has been saying that resisting China will automatically lead to a suicidal war, therefore implying that the way forward is some sort of acquiescence, which is, of course, something that is completely baseless because a lot of countries across the region have been resisting China, including the Philippines, under the previous administration, and yet there was no war. So here in his State of the Nation address, he changed his tone. He said that we're not talking about war, all-out war per se, but at least skirmishes. And even that I'm not willing to risk. So suddenly you have President Duterte becoming the peacemaker and the pragmatist here. The other thing that made his China policy very problematic was his announcement the other week that he's going to just allow the Chinese fisher folks and fishing boats to just enter the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, that he has a verbal agreement with President Xi Jinping in order to allow that. Now, that potentially violates the Philippines constitution. And of course, it's an invitation for pillage by much bigger ships from China.
Right.
And the Philippines is already struggling with food security and dropping fishing catch. But in his State of the Nation address, he intelligently pointed out the Philippines' own arbitration award and the United Nations Convention of the Sea, which actually provides some limited room for resource sharing even within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, particularly the water surrounding the contested Scarborough Shoal. So in fairness to him, his State of the Nation address was much more sober, much more calibrated, as opposed to other very controversial statements on this issue.
Graham Ong-Webb, can he resolve the dispute in the South China Sea in a peaceful way?
Well, certainly. I mean, I concur with Richard's analysis here. I mean, he's walking a very delicate line here in not pushing back, if anything, but also not, giving up the ground totally. I mean, he's being a pragmatist and a realist at the same time when it comes to dealing with China and the economic and political and military value propositions of that country. I mean, Singapore, for one, if I can say so, paid a very high price in standing the ground in terms of a rules-based order back in 2016, when it seemed that we were on the cusp of having the PCA ruling in favor of the Philippines. So I think President Duterte is more sensitive to Chinese power and is not willing to take those risks.
All right, Carlos in Manila, you have the last word on the foreign policy issue and the disputes in the South China Sea. Do you think Duterte is doing enough to resolve this dispute?
Well, to many Filipinos, he may be doing enough, but increasingly he is being viewed as too pliant to China, and that this will have some effect and impact down the line in terms of his popularity. The question really now is whether how long and how hard will he push this line, and whether he would be much more calibrated in his response to China. But as far as public temperament goes, I mean, the surveys indicate that a lot of Filipinos are not at all in favor of what he's doing with China. So, it remains to be seen whether President Duterte will try to take their sentiment into account as he moves forward. But definitely the obsequiousness that he has shown to China, he's very, very overly friendly, I would say, a posture toward China is not making a lot of Filipinos happy.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for a very interesting discussion. It was very good to talk to you about the situation in the Philippines as President Duterte continues his rule there and delivered his fourth State of the Nation address earlier. Richard Heydarian, Carlos Conde, Graham Ong-Webb, thank you very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.